Now we have Ukiyo-E. Now, growing urbanization led to a pursuit of sensual pleasures. The Tokugawa will try to limit this, but in vain. The problem is that those of lesser means could not afford the brothels or some of these pleasures of life, so they lived vicariously through a series of prints. The best known items printed in the overall counterculture that results are the Ukiyo-E Prints. And these are translated roughly as pictures of the floating world. These are often images of sensual pleasure from brothels or theater, and although they could involve beautiful young women in domestic and landscape settings, they don't always. There's often a sensual element to it at some level. And it's not always a sexual thing, it's often a sensual thing. Two different ideas, as we'll see in a moment. And we're going to start with Tsuzuki Nobu. Now, there was great demand for these prints, thus creating the need for greater refinement. In other words, creating higher quality prints. And how this worked, and this same thing happens in Europe as well, although not with the sensual element all the time, is every town would have a print shop, and that shop would post these prints in the window, and you could come in and purchase them. They were fairly low cost, and most people, if you were working class or above, could afford it. Now, Tsuzuki is one of the most emulated artists of the period. He's key in the development of color woodblock prints. And instead of using fairly inexpensive materials, he looks at this as a particularly fine, high art form, so uses only the best paper and the best pigment. He becomes especially popular amongst poet clubs, leading to this very lyrical style that he has. And he creates Evening Bell at the Clock. And this is from a collection called 8 Views of the Parlor. And here we have our two young women, and they appear to be, well, fairly sensual, even though there's no nudity and nothing particularly uncovered here. But it's the thought of what they've just been doing. Of course, they've just gotten out of the bath. One is helping the other dry off. And so you get that idea of thinking about what's under the towel that would make it sensual in one sense. Behind them in one corner, we have the clock. We'll get into that in a minute. So this is very similar to a Chinese series, but also to later Impressionist work. Here the focus is on the beautiful women and their daily activities. As we look at it in terms of perspective, just like the Night Attack, here again we seem to have this 3/4 view where we're up in a tree or in a drone looking down at the scene. But from the Japanese perspective, this is the best way to see it, because here we can see the entire scene. We can see a lot that we couldn't if we were at ground level. The two women sit on the veranda, one drying herself while the other looks towards the clock. This clock based on a massive temple bell in the Chinese original. Now in 1765, clocks are just a massive technological leap. We need them because of the Industrial Revolution, because of shift work. And so we see them being invented. But at this time, for example, in the United States, just shortly thereafter, Thomas Jefferson at Monticello is really one of the first people to have their own personal clock. And here we're seeing, instead of the massive temple clock, it's been miniaturized as if it's a clock within someone's home, this incredible luxury of the period. And we see that clock in action. We know that it must be ringing, that something must be drawing this woman's attention to that clock. We see objects are flattened, and we see this very rich color. And that is going to become one of the key elements of these prints. And look at the use of pattern. The robes are both patterned. We have the wood grain at the base of the door. We have patterns in the plants and the bamboo in the background. There's pattern throughout. And this flattening and the use of pattern is going to be key when you start looking at Impressionism, which we've already looked at. Here, Mary Cassatt on the right, and that use of pattern throughout. The striped robe, the floral pattern on the wallpaper, the dresser, the carpet with its own pattern. Repeating that use from the Japanese prints, although not repeating the flattening of form all the time. Obviously, most of the patterns are flattened in her piece, but that robe that the mother is wearing clearly isn't. It's got a three-dimensional modeled element to it. We also see that unique perspective because here in Mary Cassatt's piece, we seem to be standing over the scene, looking down on it, much like we do with Evening Bell at the Clock, although we're higher up with Evening Bell at the Clock. And both of them have a voyeuristic element to them. In the case of the Japanese original, it's as if maybe we're looking over a wall at some scene that we aren't supposed to see. In Cassatt's work, it's as if we walked into the room and they haven't seen us enter the room yet. We have this voyeuristic sense that we aren't really supposed to be there. Now, another great artist of the period is Hokusai, who's one of the best known of the woodblock artists. He creates a very famous piece. He creates a collection called 36 Views of Mount Fuji, of which this is one. Each one showing a different view of Mount Fuji and different things happening in the foreground. He's often using what's called forced perspective. So by putting us at a great distance from the mountain, he can make things in the foreground look much more massive than they really are. He can add drama to the scene, and he does so exceptionally well with the Great Wave off Kanagawa. Here, the wave almost surmounts Mount Fuji in the distance. And this is not a tsunami or something like that. These are just waves in the ocean. We could be easily 10, 15 miles offshore looking through the waves to Mount Fuji. And even though the waves are probably 20 feet or 30 feet, they're obviously not really bigger than Mount Fuji. The size of the wave and the white cap makes the image very ominous. And in a Western perspective, we would look at this and go, wow, look at man fighting nature. This is incredible. Those fishermen are out there and they are defeating nature and continuing on, and it's very victorious, but we aren't in the West. We're in Japan. So those fishermen who are particularly calm and moving their vessels through these waves, they aren't man fighting nature. These are men in nature. If you've ever been in a boat, small boat, in big water, the ocean, Lake Michigan, or even smaller water in a storm, you very quickly realize that you cannot fight against nature. Water is far stronger than you are. So what you have to do is you have to work with it. High waves like this, you might use the waves to actually surf. So you don't have to paddle. You can just sort of surf on the wave, going whatever direction it's going. If you're trying to go against the wave, then you learn very quickly to just go with it and alter your paddle stroke as you go up, crest, and go back down the wave as it passes beneath you. And that's what we're seeing here. Now we are seeing Western ideas in this scene as well. First of all, the use of forced perspective is not common to Japanese art before this period, before we get to 1826 or so. So they're bringing in this European idea of forced perspective. They're also bringing in this dark blue color, which we see here in the waves. That is Prussian blue. That is not something that the Japanese had prior. They're getting that in trade from Europe. What makes it Japanese is the flattening of form. So those waves, even though perspective tells us there's a great distance between them, they seem flattened. And we have this idea of man in nature. Now, one other thing that should stand out to you is as a woodblock print, that means every color in this image is a separate piece that has to be fitted together. And as such, it makes it very complicated. You can see the sky is made up of a couple of different colors, and every wave as well. It's really incredible craftsmanship.